A sound check. Can everybody hear me? Excellent. Okay, so welcome to today's live Q&A, where we are going to chat about how to discuss your research plan with a mentor. I am Shannon Berman, Associate Director of Scientific Training and Education at iBiology. I am also a co-producer of the iBiology Planning Your Scientific Journey course. And I am very happy to be here today with our panelists, so let me introduce them. First, we have Cynthia Furman. She is the Assistant Dean of Career and Professional Development and Assistant Professor of Biochemistry and Molecular Pharmacology at University of Massachusetts Medical School. At UMass Med School, she founded and directs the Center for Biomedical Career Development, which is dedicated to taking a scholarly approach to enhancing the professional development of scientists. We also have Rick McGee. He is the Associate Dean for Professional Development at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine, where he is responsible for assisting the transition of junior faculty as they initiate their independent research careers. Since 2014, he has been part of the National Research Mentoring Network, NRMN, expanding a highly effective grant writing coaching group program and helping to create and test novel culturally aware mentorship workshops. So I just want to thank you both so much for being here. You guys are really going to add a lot of value to this course. And I also want to welcome our Q&A audience. Some of you are possibly taking the Planning Your Scientific Journey course right now. And for those who are, you will recognize one of our speakers, Cynthia Furman. She was really great addition to the course. She really talks a lot about planning, which is incredibly helpful for grad students and postdocs. So in the course right now, students are building research plans and scheduling meetings with their mentors to discuss these plans. And our goal is to support the students in this course and all trainees really to have a productive conversation with their mentor about their research and research plan. So I'm going to start off with a couple of questions for Cynthia and Rick, and then I will ask questions from the audience. So please feel free to start typing in your questions in the live chat box on the right on the YouTube page. And we'll get to them as soon as possible. We'll also have a couple of questions already from students that were generated in the course. So before we get started with questions, though, I just want to take a second to define what we mean when we're talking about a research plan. So for the purposes of this conversation, we don't just mean your to-do list of tasks that you're going to be doing for your research project in the next week or so. Here we're talking about your research strategy for your project, at least the next 3 months, 6 months to a year. So conversations of this kind involving your research plan will likely include discussing the research question itself, the expected outcomes, and the experimental approach. So I'm going to stop talking now, and let's get to the questions. So the first question I'm going to direct at first to Cynthia. And that is, how should I go about having a conversation about my research plan with my advisor or mentor? Is this different from my normal check-in conversation with my PI? What should I have prepared for this kind of meeting?
Thanks, Shannon. I would say that it's really difficult to define what a normal conversation with a PI might be. Everyone's normal conversation may be different. Depending on their relationship with their PI and their own working styles and the working style of their PI. In general, when I reflect on when I was a scientist and when I speak with my own supervisor at times, I might think of a standard meeting as an update on what I'm working on currently and what I'll be working on in the next week or so, and perhaps focus on some challenges that I'm having and discussing it with them. I think what we're talking about here today is a bigger picture discussion about where your research is headed. What are the major milestones coming up? And how have you reached certain milestones to this point? So this is really an opportunity for you to have a bigger picture discussion with your research advisor about how you see your research moving forward. There's a number of ways that you can prepare for this meeting. I would, in particular, advise thinking ahead and coming in with an agenda to the meeting. You, as the person doing the research day-to-day, can help to drive the meeting and set the agenda. And you can come in with some highlights of some of the progress you've made since your last bigger picture meeting and a preview of some of the milestones or benchmarks you're expecting to meet moving forward. And that can start as a starting point for that conversation.
Great, thank you so much. That was great. I really appreciated your discussion about, or the distinction between kind of the weekly meetings that you may have versus the bigger picture discussion with your mentor. Rick, do you have anything that you would like to add to Cynthia's response?
Yeah, thanks very much. I think what I would add is the answer and the strategy probably changes a lot over time. It really depends on kind of where one is in the kind of in the research project and the how far along you are. So we look at taking from, say, during graduate school, when you first start out, in most cases you're relatively limited knowledge of the project that you're working on. So kind of what you can bring in a bigger picture is going to be very different than as you evolve over time in the research strategy. And I think that's typically one of the main things that happens during when you're putting together a dissertation proposal. And sometimes it's for a qualifying exam, sometimes it's just important to put it together so you know where you're going. So I think oftentimes that will evolve. So I think anyone who's listening, think of it as an evolving process, and that as you get further along, kind of how far out you can look becomes further. And I think also the degree to which you can actually come in with a full picture of kind of the science and the knowledge and the logic behind it will also change quite a bit over time. And that's normal. I think the one I would really emphasize is if you're just getting started and you kind of know this is normal, not knowing how to get started. That's, we all start at that same point, but that gradually changes over time, and the nature of the conversation will change over time as well as you become much more knowledgeable. And so the logic behind your thinking of where a project is going will begin to get much more full and much more clear as you move forward. And as you come into the conversation, as Cynthia alluded to already, come in with a plan, have an idea where you want to go, the conversation, so you aren't just kind of wandering. But it will change a lot as you evolve in the developmental process of becoming a scientist.
Yeah, and I would add that a goal for these conversations is to make sure you're on the same page and you have the similar expectations for what the priorities are moving forward. But another really important goal is to be flexible and really come forward prepared for the conversation, but be ready to listen and change course during the meeting based on where your discussion takes you.
That is all really great advice. So definitely have goals for the meeting that you want to communicate with your advisor, and also be flexible so that you can adapt to new ideas in the moment, as well as be kind to yourself and know that you're going to evolve and become better at this sorts of things as you continue to do research. So I do want to even take a step back further and just talk about why it is important to actually have a conversation with your mentor, or several conversations with your mentor during your training about your research plan. Why is talking about long-term goals incredibly important? And maybe we'll start with you, Rick.
Yeah, I think the way I would describe it is that process is how you go from doing experiments to doing research. So in other words, if you're just looking at each day, the day in and day out, you can be doing experiments, but many times you can lose sight of where these experiments going. Why am I doing this experiment versus another experiment? So it's like the difference between just doing experiments without having a long-term plan laid out. You very easily could end up spending a whole lot of wasted time going in directions that ultimately are not going to get you to where you want to go. But I think that's what evolves with time is your ability to kind of look at that bigger picture, come up with and make those decisions. Because one of the things with research, there are always different branching points. You can always go different directions. And so the longer term, kind of conversation is always looking at those different directions, the different strategies. And also, science doesn't sit still. So you may have this great plan, all of a sudden you pick up a paper and like, oh, wait a minute, but if you don't have that long-term view, you can't see how new knowledge fits into and how the new knowledge might affect that long-term strategy. But it's also this process of deciding what are the right things to do and will it keep getting me closer to the real questions, as opposed to, well, it's easy to keep doing experiments just to get them done. But it's absolutely essential. I mean, you have to have it to have good science. You have to have the longer term questions, and you have to have the longer term kind kind of reassessing it, because even how you look at things is always going to be changing. Science, it just doesn't sit still. So it's absolutely essential to have those kind of bigger directional, discussions, as well as the short term, what are we doing next week?
That's a really great answer. Yes, we absolutely need it to be good scientists, because you need direction on where to go. Cynthia, did you want to add anything to Rick's response?
Yeah, I think he nailed it, and I will add that reflecting on Rick's comments earlier, this is also about your development as a scientist. From being a student maybe to being postdoc, and into your career. And so these kinds of big picture discussions and sitting back and reflecting about your research and where it's headed or where it should head, and how all the new knowledge you're gaining and the field is gaining should influence that. That's about your development as a scientist, from an experimentalist to a researcher. And it's also something that you'll continue into your career. So, your advisor has these kinds of big picture discussions with others as well. And it might be over lunch or in other types of venues, often at conferences that they attend. But that's a really, really important part of being scientists, is thinking about the big picture and how our projects need to evolve.
Yeah, I'll just quick pop in with that. Just as Cynthia points out, literally, these are the conversations I have with faculty today. So this is evolution. This is normal way of life for science, and believe me, it doesn't change when you step over into that next. And that dialogue, the conversation going back and forth. I literally do this on a daily basis with faculty. Literally just 2 hours ago in a group grant writing group process I run, having these kind of conversations. So this is absolutely the normal part of science, continue looking at the bigger and the smaller questions simultaneously. That's really great advice. Thank you guys so much. So we've gotten a question through the live chat on how to basically have a conversation with your mentor when you don't think that your plan is going according to plan. And I actually wanted to take a step back even further and make that even bigger picture, because it seems like we get this sort of question often, which is how to have a difficult conversation with your mentor, either because you're not making progress like you want to, or your ideas don't necessarily match that of your mentor. Or you get some weird, funky result that you just can't explain. So I'm wondering if you could just give some really solid advice, tips, what have you, for one, how to prepare for a discussion like that, and two, how to navigate that discussion in the moment. And Cynthia, I was wondering if we could start with you.
So anytime you think of a difficult conversation, and in some cases this might be just a difficult conversation because you're frustrated with the project and how it's moving forward, or it might be a difficult conversation because you feel that you're maybe not making the progress you would expect of yourself, and that's going to feel difficult. But anytime you approach that kind of conversation, I think it's helpful to think ahead about what the common ground is, right? Where are the areas where you and your research advisor, in this case, will share priorities. And that might be that you want to see the project moving forward, that you want to see the science moving forward, that you're both really excited about it. Whatever the common ground is, kind of use that to keep you grounded. And you can even use that common ground to open the conversation, and then pose the challenges that you're facing and have a discussion about it. I'm going to pass to you, Rick.
Okay, yeah. I think this is, again, one of those, you'll hear me say this quite a bit, I think, throughout the session. The first response is, it depends. It depends on, and the starting point really is the nature of the relationship. And so I think that's one of the key things, is really take the time to develop a real ongoing relationship. And this both for someone you're being mentored by and someone you are mentoring. So it's goes all the different directions, because having a solid, open relationship, one of really, respect for each other, respect to how you think. I think that's the starting point. If you have that, then a whole lot of other things can work within that framework. And I guess a lot of it depends on what makes it challenging. If you think there's going to be an actual disagreement versus like, well, nothing's working, And I think one of the things there is, as much as you can in things, when you come into a conversation where you've got a problem, if you could come in the same time with kind of alternative solutions. So for example, if you've been working at something for several weeks, it's just not working, always starting from giving your best guess of what you think is going on. And so you come into the conversation, okay, this isn't working. Here is what I've done. Here's what I've analyzed. Here's my thinking. So it almost being able to come in displaying your thinking from the standpoint, this is science. Science, this is just how it behaves, or not in most cases. And so you kind of go into it with thinking, here's kind of the situation. Here's what's not working. Here's my thoughts of what we're working. If it's a kind of conversation where the most difficult is you think the whole direction ought to be one way, your mentor thinks it ought to go the other way, those are the real difficult conversations. That's where Cynthia is kind of, like you said before, kind of you have common ground, and you recognize that it's not going to always be in the same direction. That's why they call it science. That's why they call it research. If we knew the answer, it'd be simple. So I think, again, looking at it from the standpoint of, as Cynthia brought in before, always you're going to listen as much as to talk, but you go in with actually something planned ahead of time into the conversation. And again, it's absolutely like Cynthia said, you're looking at how can you come to a solution where everybody feels like, okay, we've got some kind of a workable way to move forward here, even if it isn't exactly what I wanted when I came out of it. And again, those conversations will evolve and change over time based on the degree to which you have the scientific experience to kind of, have different ways of looking at things.
Yeah, I want to add too, often we hear from students that, students, for example, meet with their thesis committees, and it's not uncommon for us to hear them say, well, I'm not ready to meet with my thesis committee because I need more preliminary data. Things aren't working. I want to wait till they're working so that I can show them what I've done. And sometimes a better way to look at that meeting is an opportunity to have multiple mentors in the room there to discuss your research with you and help you think about how to get over those challenges that you're facing. And so it might not be as much about reporting on the preliminary data or the data you have to date or your progress. It might be also about gaining their help, like Rick mentioned, bringing in your ideas for how to move forward and taking the opportunity, a really great opportunity to have these mentors in the room to help you think through whether those are the right steps or if there's other approaches you might take.
So well said, so well said. And I think you guys have really inspired more questions now. So we're definitely getting a lot more, and I'm going to pivot to more of those. Someone asked the question that, what do you do if your mentor is not willing to create a longer term plan beyond more than a couple of weeks? Like how do you navigate that situation? Maybe Rick, we'll start with you.
Can I pass? I mean, if it's now we're getting on to the real difficult conversations. You haven't hardly given us a few minutes to warm up, No, and joking aside, these are not easy. Absolutely, joking is aside. These can be difficult conversations, and I guess in that case, I would start by trying to get a handle on, trying to get a sense of why the person seems to be reluctant to look beyond a couple of weeks. Is it, there's all kinds of different explanations it may be. And when that just may be how they work, and they have a very short cycle. It may be because they don't really have an idea where it's going to go. And sometimes it can be a matter of you guys just don't know enough to know where it's going to go, and so reluctant to go to that. A more difficult one is if they don't necessarily see the person as having enough knowledge base or enough ability to kind of look beyond that. And that's more challenging, because that's suggesting that the relationship isn't one that is really mutually respecting the person's ability and what they can bring to the table. It's interesting because I can honestly say I haven't heard a lot of people run into that in the past. And so I'm thinking through the kind of things that might cause it to be the case. Sometimes it can be stress. Quite honestly, people, believe it or not, they're people first and they're scientists second, and stress can play tremendous impact on people. So I might ask the question, is this something that's always the case? Is this something that seems to just popped up? Is it something that behavior is the same for me and as it is for everybody in the lab? If it's just for me, then that raises another question of trying to understand it. And at some point, if you get too frustrated, you just call the question. So, I just, what I'm seeing here is that you never seem to be, to me, it feels, I'd like to be able to plan further out than just a couple of weeks at a time. I'd like to, one time as a student, you can say, I'd like to just practice the idea of thinking bigger in science. So can I just kind of practice this idea? So it feels like they're acknowledging, I may not be as good at this as you are, but I need to practice it. If I don't practice it, I'll never get any better. So sometimes you can reframe it into a totally different kind of a neutral situation. But I guess as much thing, try see if you can figure out what it is that's causing a person to not want to have that kind of a conversation. Cynthia, you got any solutions up your sleeve on that one?
I think that's a fantastic answer, and I want to reflect on what you just used as your language, right? You used I. You talked about what I'm observing, right? It would be help me if we could, right? Instead of saying, you never do this or you X, Y, or Z. And so using I language can I think help frame that conversation. Perhaps it could be a difficult conversation, but being open may give you really good insights. Maybe the person has a big grant deadline coming up, or there's just many different priorities, or like you said, it just might be their own personal style of planning. So having that open conversation could be really helpful.
That's really great. I really like the idea of reframing it for as a skills development opportunity, because it's true. I mean, you really have to be able to plan for the long term, even outside of science, right? It's just such an incredibly important skill.
I might just pop in one quick add to there too, is also really many times you can get advice from other people in the lab. So again, if it's a new behavior and just popped up, other people in the lab might be able to help you translate what's going on. So I think that's where other people within a research group can help each other a lot, understanding and coming up with strategies.
That's really great. Thanks so much. So we have many more questions. I hope that I can get to all of them. But one of them is, the question is, how should I ask my mentor for a side project as a plan B? And so I guess the bigger picture is, how can you do long-term planning? I guess some risks, benefits, evaluation with your mentor to come up with a plan B in the event that things don't necessarily work out. And I guess we'll start with Cynthia.
This sounds like a valuable conversation to have sometimes. If you're on a high-risk project or a project that looks like it might not be taking you where you want it to go, some of you may be in this kind of situation. When you pose that question, Shannon, it makes me remember, that you are, as a student, you have your own goals as a student, aside from the research goals. The research could continue without you, theoretically, but you need to graduate. You need to move on to the next stages of your training. Or as a postdoc, similarly, and it could be that the project needs to be shifted or what have you. So it seems like a really human conversation to me, right? In terms of, we can have a conversation about the research and both be really excited about the research, but let's also incorporate into that conversation a piece about myself and where I am developing, and thinking about my graduation or my time to finish this postdoc or this piece of my training. How does this project fit in? You can have a conversation, about, I'm concerned because on my timeline, I'm really hoping to be at this stage by this point, and I have concerns about where this project is heading. I also have a lot of excitement around this other project, and so I was wondering if we could have a conversation about how these two might interplay in the package, the portfolio of what I'm working on in the lab.
Yeah, I think the other couple of things that pop into my mind is I often say the most difficult task many times a scientist actually has to face is when to stop trying to answer a question, when to stop pursuing. And at one point do you come to that stage of saying, I've given my shot, it's just not working, or this is just not going in the direction. So again, I frame this from the standpoint of almost I needing to practice that. At the same time also practicing the idea of coming up with a different idea, and especially if an idea is high risk, acknowledging high risk. Okay, and so almost acknowledging, I know that is probably a crazy idea, but it's something that I think could be kind of cool. You know, how about it'd be great if I could have maybe just spend 1 day a week or something like that. But at the same time, I would always start with putting a boundary on it, so that a person, a PI, doesn't begin to see this as something that could completely take everybody off track here. Because when you're starting a new idea, especially something that may be quite novel, you actually have to be careful in the beginning to put some boundaries on it, say I'm going to try this much effort, kind of walk along a little bit as I, again, get to practice this idea of coming up with ideas. And it's this balancing of risk and reward. And I think what you'd be surprised, most PIs, they totally get it. I mean, they live this life every day in and day out. So as much as you're kind of acknowledging you're practicing this and acknowledging if an idea, and sometimes negotiating. So it's a form of negotiation in terms of where, and I think a lot of it may depend too on how much resources are available. So if you're in a research group that has lots of money, then all of a sudden the tolerance for that goes up. If you're in a research group that every dollar matters, then I think you have to be really cautious about that, because it's a difficult business, and it can really, ebb and flow depending on the ratio of resources available to the number of people who need them. So again, I think I'd be real sensitive to that kind of, the environment that everyone finds themselves in these days.
Yeah, that's really important. And there might be some certain goals or milestones that your group needs to reach for grants and other things that they've committed to. So it's really important to have that kind of open conversation and be flexible in listening.
Those were both really great answers. Yes, I really like that idea about, it depends. It really depends on the resources of your lab and whether coming up with a plan B makes sense. But if you've identified this as something that's important, then really being open in the conversation about why that is important to you. So we've definitely been getting a few questions related to this, and we've also been getting some questions in the course itself about the scenario where your research interests or your ideas don't necessarily align with your mentor. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about that specifically. How do you negotiate that conversation or a series of conversations when you're developing a research project, or let's say when you're deciding on what new direction to take, where the ideas themselves are not matching? What specifically can you advise to students with this problem? And I guess maybe Rick, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, because it also is a little hard. It could frame in a couple of different ways. One where you went into a lab thinking I had this great idea and I'm going to move this direction going into the lab. Those are more difficult, because even in the initial conversation it might sound like a great idea, but when push comes to shove, all of a sudden it's a lot harder to do that. But if you're in a research group and your interests are evolving, it's tough if you're really kind of committed to that group, and then all of a sudden your interests are really changing. Aside from leaving the group, which is the ultimate outcome if it gets too far estranged, there's only so much latitude, particularly if they're going so far afield, they may not be within scope of the research funding. You have to be careful is that research funding is provided from some agency among a scope of research, and all of a sudden you find your research going out of scope, you really don't have, unless you've got your own money, it's pretty hard to go that far. It also may depend on if the other scenario where the lab or the PI, their interests may be shifting, they may be going into a direction you're not interested in. That's a whole nother scenario. And it's, again, you just have to kind of negotiate that and kind of acknowledge it, and is there room for both? And again, with all these things, is there any way to have kind of both at the same time? So sometimes that begins splitting your time, because initially when you start out as a graduate student, you don't want to split your time too much. You want to get focused, but as you get more mature, you can split your time. So that would be one possibility. But it's one of the more difficult scenarios if the shift is really great. If all of a sudden you're I have seen this actually with graduate students, and it's where you come into a lab, you think it's going to be great, then all of a sudden a year or two in, you just totally lost interest in the lab. It does happen, and not on sometimes in those cases it's actually better to just acknowledge it, and move on. That does happen, and sometimes that's the best outcome for everybody, because it's hard as a scientist to really put in the time and effort if it just isn't interesting to you. So sometimes you just have to face that and have that. That could be a really difficult conversation, but usually it's a good one to have, I would say.
Yeah, if there truly is, you fundamentally just don't enjoy doing the project day to day, have real trouble being excited about it, an exit strategy out of the group might be the best solution. And it's important to think of exit strategies throughout your career in lots of different scenarios. And so that's actually a really good skill to have too, is recognizing in yourself when it's actually just better to, thank the person for what you've gotten and exit. Like this question stems from, those ideas are okay, but I'm really excited about this and I really want to pursue this. I think in that case, this might also be another negotiation conversation where you can talk about potentially, doing this other thing you're really excited about on the side, while reassuring your research advisor that this core project is really important and you recognize that and you'll carry it through. If that's the case, I think my own personal approach would be to feel probably a little disappointment maybe for the thing that I realize is really cool and I really wish I could pursue. But to recognize that it's a lot of fun to work for somebody when they're really excited about your project also. And so there's a lot of benefits for you to look for the things that you find exciting and rewarding in the project that your research advisor is also really excited about. If that's possible, as a student or as a postdoc, you're on these projects temporarily. And as anyone in science, really, a lot of science projects can move and change over time. And again, you can always exit. But I love the idea of working for somebody on something that you're both excited about. And remember, they will be an important recommendation or reference for you in the future. And so having a strong, open working relationship where you can talk openly about these things, but find a good solution is really important.
I would just piggyback a little bit on that too, in terms of it really brings up how important it is to, when you're beginning to engage in initial mentoring relationship, really spend the time, really think carefully. This idea of, well, I really love the group, I really don't like the science, but I love working with the group. That's probably not the best scenario. Likewise, if I really love the science, but I really don't like the people, that also isn't going to be necessarily a very workable, kind of situation. So I think it really highlights the importance of thinking very carefully of both the science and the people whenever you're beginning to look at any new scientific relationship that you're going into, especially as a trainee. Really do your homework, really find out if this is a good fit, because it's a period of time, and a major shift is not the most fun thing in the world. Everyone wants to avoid that if at all possible.
That's definitely true. And graduate students have the benefit often of being able to rotate through labs, and so be able to test out those personal working relationships and the dynamics within the group, as well as the research projects fit. Postdocs, and others at different stages don't necessarily have that opportunity. So I think it's really good advice to ask some really good questions, interview in person if you can, and really think about whether a position's the right fit for you.
That's all really great, and I'm so glad that you touched on this idea of finding a balance of good mentorship with really interesting research. One thing that we haven't really touched on at all in this course is the importance of finding good mentorship and how to do that. We hope to do that, with future resources. But I know this is a huge topic, and it wouldn't even be possible to cover it in the next 30 minutes. But I'm just wondering if you guys could just, maybe just give some general advice on how one could seek, good mentorship. Doesn't necessarily have to be with your PI, but maybe if you're not getting your needs met, like how do you seek mentorship from other people, and whom should you seek mentorship from? And I think I started with Rick last time, so let's start with Cynthia, although I could be forgetting. But
sure. Well, I think once you have a research advisor, finding additional mentors really comes through building relationships with people, right? And they might be peer mentors, and it's also important to have mentors that are higher developmental stages than yourself, right? So people more senior to yourself. But it's really about meeting people, having conversations, discussing science, just normal relationship building, nothing special to this, right? But then with the people who you find it really exciting to talk with them, they seem likewise engaged in what you're doing. They seem like they're good listeners. Those might be people that you could think about building stronger relationships with more in terms of being a mentor for you. And it's really important to think about having multiple mentors. Mentors for your research, because your research is probably multifaceted and could have value from having perspectives from a number of different, subdisciplines or, different people who specialize in different techniques, whatever it is. So that type of mentorship is important. Also, mentorship for how to navigate the challenges of science is really important. And fields where you want to move into in the future for your career or the next step of your training. So I think it really starts with the relationship building.
And I actually might step it back a little bit further too, in terms of it really starts from looking at what is it you're looking for and really identifying specifically. So it's moving it. I think we've got research mentors, within science. You have a kind of a concept of those are kind of this, this holistic combination of different things, and you kind of can see that. But even those no two relationship there alike. But after that, I guess I would, almost take the specific of, well, I'm looking for specifically for a mentor for something, and it can actually be really quite small. We were starting to talk about it more from almost very precise short-term mentoring to complement. And as Cynthia's pointed out, having relationships kind of enables that, but also can be like I use the example with faculty. So for example, I'm about to write a journal article for a journal I've never written for before, and I see there's a person around me who is published in that. All of a sudden, gee, I see you published in this journal, I never have. I wonder if you could so I could use you a little bit to help me understand how to write for this kind of a journal. That's mentoring from the standpoint, and it's very narrowly defined, and you'll almost never have anybody say no. But if you have to go up to somebody and say, gee, will you be my mentor? The first response is, what does that mean? And it sounds like a big task. So if you can break it down to these little bits, and sometimes like individual development plans or other ways, but it really starts from looking at yourself. What is it you feel that you need? What could be helpful? And then who are the people around me who could help me with that specific thing, as opposed to, so it really starts with this internal self-reflection and looking at yourself as the starting point, I think is really important. We start looking beyond kind of the classic research mentoring.
That's really great. I really love that you brought up the self-reflection. I mean, that's always so important to do, especially when you're doing anything, making any big leap for any type of career, but for science, it's especially important. So we've gotten some questions, possibly from a postdoc. They want to know, is there any specific advice for postdocs on how to manage their relationship with their mentors? And I'm assuming it's because the postdoc is a bit of a weird position in that they're not quite a grad student, but they're not quite an independent researcher. So can you give any advice for postdocs specifically on mentoring and how to get good mentorship? And we'll start with you, Rick.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole there's a whole world of looking at developing skills in mentoring relationships. We've actually they're probably the leading group and the leading people who really define what are the attributes of effective mentoring relationship, how you think about this and break it down into these attributes of this relationship, how you acknowledge the tension between my needs and the other person's needs, acknowledging all these things. That's out of the University of Wisconsin, the group that have been for many years, have really core elements of how you achieve effective mentoring relationship. Now, most of that in the past has been taught as mentors. We've actually published a book chapter on something called Mentoring Up. And so that's the way, if you actually look at and learn the elements of effective mentoring relationship, you can actually manage your own relationships. But it really comes down to communication. And one of the problems we run into is science, so much of our communication is oblique or sometimes silent. We're not really good at just kind of being direct and kind of putting out there, okay, this is what I'd like to talk about. So I think it's communication, and then there are some really core attributes. It's a skill. It literally, we've moved into thinking about mentoring in these relationships as a skill in managing and developing relationships. So that's why I would look at it from the standpoint of looking at what is my current relationship with this person? How did it get to where it is? What do I like about it, what I don't like about it, and what is it I'd like to be different about that relationship, in this case with a postdoc, with a, and what are the things you guys can, two of you can talk easily about, and what are the things you don't seem to talk about. And now how do you begin to kind of, half the time it's just all of a sudden saying, I've really been worried about this, I really would like to talk about that. It's like, oh, why didn't you tell me? So much of the time our assumptions are that someone doesn't want to talk with, no, you just have never posed the question before. So I think those are the way I should really look at it in terms as a relationship. What's good about it? What are we struggling about as a relationship, not just him or me or her or me from that standpoint.
Yeah, I think, as a postdoc, you don't have quite the same structure around you as a student would have. As students come into graduate school with a cohort, and so they have more opportunities to build relationship with peers for peer mentoring. And graduate students might rotate through multiple labs or go through courses where they can meet more faculty, and it's easier to find mentors. For postdocs, that core mentoring relationship with your research advisor is really important. And so mentoring up is really, really important. And in addition to that, I think giving your own structure to your mentoring is really key. So finding, as we mentioned earlier, identifying what your needs are, what are areas in which you need to grow, and reflecting on that and creating a plan through an individual development planning process, for example, can help you recognize where you need to develop further and where you need to take your project further, and therefore identify how you can build your own structures into place. Imagining, those students out there who have something more structured around them, or curriculum, for example, then you can think to yourself, what's the curriculum that I need? That might be courses, that might largely be individual conversations with people, or gathering together people who can coach you in different areas, proactively asking for feedback. I think a lot of it becomes a lot more proactive on your shoulders as a postdoc. But students, you're not off the hook. You should be proactive too.
Yeah, I just want to totally reemphasize what Cynthia just said. This idea of it's your life, and as much as you can take control over it, as opposed to sitting back and hoping these mentors figure out, how you get your life in place. No, as much as you can, you really have to be taking the active voice and active process in all of this.
Such good advice. And following along that last thought, Rick, is we've gotten a question here as well, several in the course, that kind of are linked to kind of building self-confidence, or the need to build self-confidence and being assertive. And so, what do you do if, let's say, your advisor is very domineering and they have they're very opinionated in their ideas? Like, how are you able to kind of toe the line and to be able to kind of hear them out and, at least acknowledge what they're saying, but at the same time be true to what you really want to do? And I guess we'll start with Rick.
Thanks a lot. This is, I think the most important thing, as much as you can, is not let it feel, this is easy to say but hard to do, but try really hard not to feel like it's about you, and usually it's about the other person and their need to control, or they're feeling that, well, if you beat somebody up, in the end if they survive, they'll be stronger, something silly like that. But it's a matter of recognizing to a certain extent of, no, this is I'm okay. This person has, they have an approach that they think is right. It doesn't work for me. So again, as much as you can, steel yourself from letting it affect you as much as you can. And then again, coming up, looking for ways to de-escalate, looking for ways of in some, it's just coming up with some other kind of strategy. It's actually very difficult, because you have to first figure out, where is this coming from? Where is this behavior coming from? And think of it as their behavior. what's driving their behavior. It's not me that's driving their behavior, it's them that's driving their behavior. And so how can I understand where it's coming from, and is there any way to kind of de-emphasize it or de-escalate it, or have other people who are better, who've had more experience with it, but again, trying to protect it from taking you down too much in that process, because usually it's about their behavior, not about your behavior. Cynthia, you want to chime in while I see if I have other words of wisdom to add in this one?
Yeah, that's a really difficult thing, and people in all walks of life and all career paths and across science and all institutions experience these things. I think that's great, Rick. I think I'll build on that by saying there's a lot of resources on your campuses locally or at your institutions that can help you, right? So there are certainly core skills that you can use with working with difficult managers, difficult mentors or advisors. But often the situation is so individual that it's helpful to talk with someone individually to describe your situation and think through what strategies you can use and build your skills that way. So some examples of resources on your campuses might include an ombudsman office or a conflict resolution center on your campus. Staff in those centers often can offer individual confidential appointments, and they have real strong skills in how to negotiate difficult conversations and difficult relationships. Career counselors on your campus might be good resources, or directors of postdoc offices. Sometimes they have training in these things or have talked with other scientists who can be in difficult situations. Also counseling offices, just having people to talk with, because there's emotions that come up when you feel like you're working with someone or working for someone who might feel overbearing or have these other elements that make the work more challenging. So a lot of institutions have employee assistance programs or other types of programs available to their employees, including their postdocs, and there's also often services for students. So I encourage you to take advantage of all those different types of more individual resources to help you work through situations.
That's really great. So I wanted to kind of pivot a little bit to maybe a little bit more troubleshooting. Whereas, what if, let's say you can't even have a conversation with your mentor about your plan because they're just not very accessible. You just, for whatever reason, you're really trying to schedule them and you just can't get them scheduled. So what is your advice for, dealing with a mentor like that? And I guess, Cynthia, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think sometimes this happens because it's just the standard MO of a advisor, and other times it happens because they're in the middle of big deadlines, or maybe they have a really big group and it's difficult for them to keep movement on priorities for you at a pace that's important for you. I think there are different approaches. One is, again, to come down to the common ground and say, I know we both really want to see this paper get submitted. It's been difficult for me to get feedback from you. What's the best way for me to work with you on this? Or what's the best way for me to help move the project forward? Because I recognize that you're really busy. Whatever it is, right? So I think there are ways that you, as the people day-to-day driving your research project forward, might think creatively or offer ways to your advisor for ways that you can help move the project forward to a place while you're waiting to meet with them. Rick, jump in here. What are some other ideas?
Yeah, you can see there are not a lot of easy answers to these questions, as you can see. So we're acknowledging the complexity of these questions. And I'm sure that people are posing them many times are living them, which is much harder than us having to just try to respond to them. Again, I think I've heard this one. I might come down to this one again. One of the situations, it depends. It depends on the, is this, say, as Cynthia said, this is just how they work. And is their expectation even as a mentor? A lot of people do believe that as a mentor, it's up to you to figure out, I'm just kind of here, and it's almost like it's a proof that you can do it by being independent. Others are just so, they're just overcommitted or something like that. They just, and again, is this ongoing or is it episodic? Sometimes, it's either just okay, I'll find it somewhere else. And so I think I would look at, again, where is it that I'm stuck? How can I get unstuck? And is there somebody else that I can turn to? Because again, I think always in research groups, it's always, we always tell people, you're not actually just, working with a person, you're moving and working with a group. So looking at other people in that group, looking where you can get guidance, especially if this is episodic, there are times where you just need some help. Hopefully there will be other people. And sometimes this is where you're turning to someone, a senior person outside, just for some temporary or some initial, guidance and what have you. But again, always looking at if it's chronic and nothing you see seems to affect it, well, you almost just have to come up with, okay, what's my best strategy to survive it? And get to whatever endpoint I'm trying to get to, and then move on, and just be maybe a little bit more cautious about the the situations I get myself into in the future. Sometimes there isn't an easy solution other than just to get by it and get done with it as soon as you can and move on to a better situation.
Very well said. Very well said. So we have 10 minutes till, and I do want to get to at least a couple questions about kind of follow-up and accountability. How can one ensure to get the most out of a meeting? I know we've talked a lot about, kind of preparing yourself for the meeting and kind of navigating the conversation in the moment. So it sounds like, you really need to think hard and deeply about what you want to get out of that conversation before you step in to the meeting. And also, prepare by writing an agenda and sending it to your mentor. But what about the follow-up? Like, what do you do once the meeting is over? Like, how can you ensure that, the ideas are integrated well, and that, you're able to implement them going forward and actually do make a change? And I think we'll start with Rick.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we always recommend in these situations, especially because everyone has got so many things in their brains all the time that are, trying to keep track of, is recommend following up with just simply an email. In terms of just want to make sure that, I know we had talked about a lot of things today. I just want to make sure that I've got it right in terms of exactly what we had come to the conclusion. So it's an email follow-up. It's not accusatory. I don't think you're going to follow through it ever. It's a note-taking of just kind of say, here's what I thought we came away with today. And I think the degree of detail might be dependent on how important it is, the precision of those details, and how close it's coming to some kind of deadline or something like that. It may be broad stroke. It may be we agreed that I'm going to go ahead and try this for next month. And after 1 month, we're going to reassess. If it's not making any progress, then we're going to talk about it again. So being fairly concrete without being, to a point of saying, well, I'm going to hold you to this contract kind of a thing. But it's much to help you, because, again, unless, it's gotten to the point now, unless something's written down, it probably didn't happen. And certainly no one's going to remember it. There's just no way. Our brains just have so much coming in and out. So it's as much for yourself even to remember what it is that we had talked about. So it's a way of back to this idea of communication, and whether communication is verbal, and the degree to which it can be remembered versus this is something we really want to remember, as we go forward. It just gives a kind of a milestone. I think that we're finding in general more and more, with so many things happening so fast, some kind of a written record, and an email is a written record, of what we talked about. And that's why going into it, also thinking about what is it I want to come out of this meeting with. So this idea, when you're planning for a meeting, you start from, what do I want to come out of the meeting with? And then, okay, what do I need to have the structure, the process to come out of it with this? And also understanding your style of communication versus someone else's style of communication. And that's one of the key things we get into when we talk about mentoring skills and relationships, is understanding, I love to just kind of blue sky or what have you, and that may be great. And you come to the end of your hour and you have all this blue sky with nothing to show for it. Or maybe your mentor is that way. So, okay, they're that way, so you have to have an agenda. So it's like, okay, this is what I want to come out with. They know ahead of time, so you're actually telling them, this is what I want to come out of this meeting with. So it'll kind of bound them to a certain extent as well. But I think the documentation for everybody's value is really important.
Yeah, I want to emphasize that. It might feel awkward or strange to summarize the next steps in an email, but it can be a pretty short email even. The level of detail is as is appropriate in the situation. But I would agree. I always appreciate it when people follow up an email. that way. Because yeah, my life is busy, right? The lives of your advisors are busy, and so it can be a really nice summary and reminder to them. And it helps communicate that you really understood the outcome, and so it might give them a sense of relief or a feeling of trust in that the project will move forward the way it was discussed. I want to add to that kind of summary can start at the end of the meeting. So this is something that I think we often forget. Right, is that we have a meeting, we discuss ideas, like Rick said, kind of we could be blue sky, meaning we get excited about all these different ideas. Even if we're talking through details, we might talk through details about this project and then this project and this project. I found it's really, really valuable at the end of the meeting, just in the last minute, say this has been such a valuable meeting. All right, so just to summarize, this is what I heard are the next steps. And you just say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Very, very brief. You don't describe them in depth because you just discussed them, but that way you know that you and the person in the room with you, your advisor, whoever it is, are on the same page. And that makes for a real easy email then to follow up with afterwards as well. That way, if there's any confusion or disagreement, or when you list it, you have the opportunity to say, oh, but wait a minute, we didn't discuss what happens if this happens, right? So you can catch things in the moment with the person in the room if you need to.
And it's a great way to catch sooner rather than later if all of a sudden you thought one thing and the other person thought something else. And believe me, that does happen. And it's much better to catch that right off the bat than have it lingering until a month later when memories are fading at best.
That's so great. It took me so long to learn that skill. So we actually have another question that's kind of related to the answers that you guys have just given, and that is pretty much, I think it's related to note-taking, so how to kind of keep track of a discussion that's constantly focusing or evolving over time, and pretty much it sounds like, well, you really have the agenda, kind of think about roughly how much time you want to spend on each thing that you want to talk about. And for me personally, what I do is I take notes, in my agenda. I have it on my laptop, and it's just like it's a living document. And I take notes for what's being said under each thing, and it helps me keep track of what's going on. But it also helps us stay to the task of the agenda. So yeah, that's basically my strategy. And if you guys, in the next minute or so, have any other strategies that you wanted to put forward, please do, Rick or Cynthia.
Yeah, I've gone one step further in terms of, again, I do a lot of conversation with people about research strategy and what have you, and the note-taking is great, but actually it disengages you shifting to have to try to write it down. So I literally have, right here my little pocket recorder, and when I'm engaging a conversation about something like this that actually we may come up with something, I just record it. And then we can ship the little files around and stuff, because it allows you then to really engage in the conversation, as opposed to, oh, well, stop a minute, stop talking, let me type, especially if you're getting into some really complicated decisions about research strategies and stuff. It actually, and if you don't need it, fine, electrons are free, you just let go. So I've actually gone to that level of needing to try to capture the conversations that we have along research direction design.
Rick, when you do that, I'm assuming that you ask people or let people know ahead of time that you're recording, or ask them if they're okay with recording the conversation.
Oh yeah, because I just tell them it's going to send it to you when we're done, just so we can have a freer conversation. And it's sitting on my desk, but certainly if anybody ever has any, I don't do it if it's a kind of advising kind of a conversation, but no, we're talking about just research moving forward, research ideas. And most people, it's like, wow, I never thought of that. Yes, please do. Kind of a thing. Yeah, but absolutely, nothing, never mind. I'll just leave it at that.
That's really great. So I wanted to ask one final question, and that's a question on accountability. So what are some strategies that you recommend for someone to hold themselves accountable to their research plan? And I know you kind of already discussed some of those. And how often should you be following up with your mentor or mentors to talk about your long-term research goals? And Cynthia, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I think one thing that we've raised a few times that's really important to remember and think about deliberately and intentionally is outlining the next steps, right? And the next steps being very specific in terms of, I will do this by this date, and then you will do this by this date, right? So what's the action, what will happen? You know, what's the time frame or the date by which it'll happen, and who's the person doing it? And framing it that way gets down to real specifics. And when you're really specific and you write it down and you send it by email, that's one way to hold each other accountable. It's almost like this informal psychological contract that you're developing with you and yourself, or you and the person you're working with. What was your follow-up question?
So yeah, how often should you meet with your mentor or mentors to discuss your long-term goals?
Oh, sure. You know, I would think big picture planning meetings. I think that really depends on where you are in your developmental stage as a scientist, as Rick said at the very, very beginning. So that will determine a lot of when it's appropriate to return to these bigger picture conversations. It might be once a month. It might be every 3 months. I think certainly every 6 months for anyone probably is kind of the farthest out you should go in terms of having these big picture meetings, which might be different from the sometimes annual thesis committee schedule that students might be used to. I really think having bigger picture conversations more frequent than that is important.
Yeah, I would just add, that's about the same time frame I would think of. More often than every 6 months can feel like, if things don't change that fast. So a lot of it depends on the nature of the project. And with the other one, let's see. Oh yeah, the other thing that I would suggest when you're coming up with the time is, after you come up with this grand plan, and say, okay, now let's talk reality check. Okay, how does this really fit with the things you have going on in your life, and how does it fit with the things I have going on? I have to do that in my own research group at this point. It's like I'm really bad at saying, oh yeah, we can do this. And say, okay, reality check time. Okay, when is this going to fit into the things that are already in the schedule? So reality checks can be really valuable at some point along the line.
Wow, well, thank you so much. So we've reached the end of our time, unfortunately. I feel like I could talk to you guys forever. Congratulations, you guys have navigated an incredibly hard topic to discuss, because having conversations just are inherently difficult. And then when you add in the mix of doing research and science and its unpredictability, it just makes it even harder. So thank you so much, you guys, Rick and Cynthia, for being here and answering these questions and really giving such wonderful, thoughtful responses. We're getting a lot of really great responses through the live chat. So yeah, we want to thank our audience for joining us today for this live Q&A. If you would like to know more about iBiology and upcoming events, please follow iBiology on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, or sign up for our newsletter on the webpage at iBiology.org. If you are interested in the Planning Your Scientific Journey course, we will host it again this October. Stay tuned to our channels for information about registering, and the URL that you can use is a bit.ly URL. It's bit.ly/PLANSCI journey. That's Plan Sci Journey. And we'll make sure we include the URL on this YouTube page for you. So thank you again very much, and we're going to end this Q&A.